context imbues meaning into data, and then it allows you to make sort of decisions based on that context. And context can shift, but context oftentimes reflects very much the priorities of an organization, of a country, of a people, and I think that that's one of the things that tends to get separated from data in general whenever it's sort of flowing through. So curation, if you think about it, is really also sort of the twin of context, right? So context in some sense allows you to understand the circumstances under which something has meaning. And curation is, interestingly, you are selecting certain pieces of information to highlight, or certain, artifacts to highlight. And what it does is it allows people to start to make certain decisions based on what has been highlighted. So in some sense, it gives you a little bit more control. But curation is important because most of us drown in data. We can't possibly figure out, if we read anything and everything that's basically published, we don't really come to any conclusions. So there is an understanding that if there's some expertise involved in selecting what we see, it helps us understand. And that's the same as if you walked into a museum and saw an exhibit, someone has curated that exhibit.
Hi, welcome to Inside Edge. This is a podcast about how breakthrough insights are generated. My name is Vivek Banerjee. I'm the author of Inside Edge and the founder of the company Inside Dojo. In this series, I speak to leading scientists, artists, business leaders, creative thinkers, writers on how insights are generated. And today we have a really interesting guest. We have Ying, who has written this book. It's called Rushing Headlong, Health IT's Legacy and the Road to Responsible AI. And it's a really interesting book because it's about the adoption of AI in the context of healthcare IT in a way that should serve patients and physicians well. And it highlights how if you don't address some of the structural issues and you adopt technology really fast, you might exacerbate many problems. And that's why I found it really interesting, because it's all about being very design-oriented in serving human beings. And what's also very interesting about it is the industry itself, because if you're operating in some other industry like soft drinks or detergents, how you adopt AI matters to the companies, but probably to the rest of us, it's not so important. On the other hand, getting it right in healthcare is crucial for everyone. It's literally a matter of life and death. And from that standpoint, also, it's a very interesting book. So welcome to the podcast, Ying. Really nice to have you here.
Thank you, Vivek. Really appreciate being invited to join your podcast.
Fantastic. So the first question is, it's about your background. It's very interesting because you've looked at the health IT space from different angles. You're a trained doctor. You've studied medicine in Yale Medical School. Then you've got an MBA from Harvard Business School. Then you've had a string of kind of different types of employments, whether it's entrepreneurial, working for Pfizer, etc. So can you briefly talk about your background?
Absolutely. So I guess the best way to think about it is that I am what I would kind of call like a tech humanist, or an AI, and these days maybe more of an AI humanist. And I think I've been that philosophically for a long time. I started my career as an emergency medicine physician, but while I was training, I encountered kind of two major events, and that really what sent me down a pathway that was probably a little bit unusual. When my first year of medical school started in the United States, at Yale, Hillary Clinton was at that time the first lady, and she started a task force, a healthcare task force, for the purposes of actually trying to push for insurance reform. And what was interesting was that task force did not include a single physician. And then a little later on in my medical education, the internet opened up and new companies came out that started providing health information to consumers. And I got really excited because I said, "Oh my goodness, here's an opportunity actually to sort of to level the playing field around healthcare information." And at the same time, it was still bothering me that there was really no physicians involved in any of sort of the policy reforms. So if you think about it from those two sort of those two events really gave me a perspective that, listen, if physicians are not at the table and if the emerging health IT is moving as fast as it was, and at that time we did think it was quite fast, nothing compared to the way AI is moving, but at that time quite fast with health IT, we would actually never improve healthcare. And that's what caused me to take a leap. From there, I ended up pivoting. I went to Harvard Business School and I graduated at the top of the dot-com boom, which actually was a good time because what it did was it allowed me into the my first startup and then basically a career made up of working with companies that were supporting startups. I moved on later to Pfizer and even to Medidata with the job title, honestly, that would allow me to be able to continue to invest and support startups that would even support the infrastructure of healthcare IT. The second half of my career actually moves over into entrepreneurship. So after Medidata, so after about a 10-year run of working for Pfizer and for Medidata, and also sort of launching and supporting a wonderful, interesting set of initiatives and startups, I ended up sort of slipping to the other side and became an entrepreneur myself. I started a company called Context Matters in 2010. And then I shifted very quickly from there on to real world evidence after I sold my first company and supported a series of companies who were all trying to deal with the data and the analytics that came from basically all of the infrastructure that had been built in the decade prior. So the second half of my career focuses very heavily on the data and the analytics around making sense of that data. And as I sort of shift along the way as an entrepreneur, I also start sitting on a number of boards, a number of advisory boards. And in many respects, I feel like this last part of my career has really been focused heavily on trying to educate everyone about how we could be going forward in a way to sort of solve the problems that we identified actually over 25 years ago.
Great, great. I mean, at this point, one comment to the viewers. I mean, to me, one of the interesting things is that Ing has kind of launched her book recently, and yet this idea has been incubating for a very long time. And this happens often. Ing mentioned the disconnect when she saw that Hillary Clinton's team did not have a physician, and that disconnect and all this experience kind of over time culminates into some kind of an idea. And we see that with insight a lot of times that people assume that it happens all very fast. But Stephen Johnson talks about how good ideas come and the whole concept of a slow hunch and how slow hunches connect and create ideas. So it's from that standpoint, this is really interesting. One of the things that interested me a lot is you kind of founded a company called Context Matters, and we always talk about how context matters, and in fact, I think there's a book also called Context Matters, right? But could you explain in the context of healthcare IT, when you're talking about context matters, what do you exactly mean by that?
So a lot of data doesn't mean very much unless it is a specific context. Like something that might be valuable for one person is not necessarily valuable for someone else. Something that might seem meaningful for a particular drug may not be meaningful for another drug. Something that might be more important to one government may not be important to another government. The point is that unless you context imbues meaning into data, and then it allows you to make sort of decisions based on that context. And context can shift, but context oftentimes reflects very much the priorities of an organization, of a country, of a people. And I think that that's one of the things that tends to get separated from data in general whenever it's sort of flowing through. So that's kind of a general concept around context matters. For the specific reason for building this company, it was actually based on something really interesting that I sort of noticed in the sort of the late 2000s before 2010. And in the late 2000s, there was this new concept at the time around health economics, outcomes research, where it was this idea that you could compare one drug to another purely by basically doing this rather crude kind of meta-analysis, saying that if drug A is better than drug B and drug B is better than drug C, then somehow drug A is better than drug C. Like there was this sort of like fallacy of thinking that everything would kind of move in that direction. And what was interesting was many different governments were starting to try and figure out how to handle the cost of pharmaceutical products and trying to figure out what was the most equitable way to distribute it amongst their population. And so the order to do that, because they might have been lacking some of the data that a clinical trial might provide for multiple types of hypothesis, instead what they were trying to do was they took whatever was published or whatever existed in clinical trial data and tried to create a meta-analysis around it so that they could basically say, well, this drug might work better for one subpopulation versus another. And in my country, I have one subpopulation that's greater than another, or there are certain markers this subpopulation has that others don't, and therefore it is a very good drug for their particular population, and maybe it's better than what I already have, and it's a good use of the dollars that we have from our budget. That sort of logic was started playing itself out and sort of rising with it was a demand for more and more data and more sophisticated analysis. And one of the things that was starting to happen was in the pharmaceutical industry, we were finding that multiple countries, through health technology assessment agencies, were starting to do very sophisticated analysis to start to determine not only whether they would provide coverage for a particular therapeutic for their population, but the conditions under which they would do it for and for the price that they would do it for. And it was such an unusual concept to those in the United States who were accustomed to free pricing around any new therapeutic. Has a lot more to do with sort of the American mentality. That I felt the need to build a company that sort of showcased how every country around the world basically looked at the same data, but would come up with very different conclusions about whether or not a drug might be more useful for their population and whether it was worth covering and under what conditions.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and we encounter that a lot because, as you know, at Inside Dojo, we do a lot of work to commercialize products, not only in healthcare but in other industries. But in healthcare, we often encounter the situation where a company comes and wants to treat all of Europe as one sort of unit, and the reality, as you said, I mean, the role of evidence in the UK is very different, and the way drugs are evaluated is very different from in other countries, and that reflects in how physicians also behave. So it's a big thing for us all the time, that we really emphasize how context matters. But I think that's a great theme that comes out in your book. So the other kind of point I wanted to talk about is you start the book by talking about curation and how important that is. And you talk about, I think, do you talk about Medscape?
Yes.
Of, the early people who took all the medical data and made it meaningful for patients, and that empowered patients, and they got more interested, and which led to a certain kind of movement. Can you talk about the importance of curation and what it takes?
So curation, if you think about it, is really also sort of the twin of context, right? So context in some sense allows you to understand the circumstances under which something has meaning. And curation is, interestingly, you are selecting certain pieces of information to highlight, or certain, artifacts to highlight. And what it does is it allows people to start to make certain decisions based on what has been highlighted. So in some sense, it gives you a little bit more control. But curation is important because most of us drown in data. We can't possibly figure out, if we read anything and everything that's basically published, we don't really come to any conclusions. So there is an understanding that if there's some expertise involved in selecting what we see, it helps us understand. And that's the same as if you walked into a museum and saw an exhibit, someone has curated that exhibit so that you understand maybe the life of the artist or the work of the artist or whatever influenced that artist. One of the greatest things about Medscape is one of the earliest examples of us using curation in a broad-based way around medical information. And for those of you who may not remember, Medscape later became WebMD, was sold to WebMD. But when it was first started, it was actually started by a group of journalists. They were medical journalists. And what they did was they took all the journal articles that were coming out that were written purely for physicians and scientists and for other people who had more technical expertise, and they were converting this information into something that was much more readable by a general audience. And in doing that process and now making it available on the internet, which again was like the distribution channel for all of a sudden information more widely available around the world and around the country. What they did by doing that was they opened up the audience of people who would actually be reading this information. And in doing so, they also empowered patients because they empowered all of us. All of a sudden, you weren't talking about new journal findings or new medical findings only limited to either a journalist on TV telling you about sort of some top highlights, or that you had to be a physician or somebody with technical expertise to understand it. Now, all of a sudden, this information was available to you, and it would, in theory, allow you to basically start to take a stance on your own health because you would be able to get more information about your own health, and you'd be able to ask questions a little smartly. And for me, that was really the breakthrough because that sort of equalized what was, in many respects, an asymmetry of information that was, in many respects, making a patient-physician relationship that of the old days, in which it was still very one way, into something that was more two-way.
Yeah, and you make the point that context is critical for curation, right? And if you're doing it across different contexts, you're losing the power that curation has. And
So,
no, it does a great point, and we can see the role of the patient voice in clinical trials, and bringing about new drugs. So that's actually a very inspiring story. So now let's talk about the book. What is the central idea? If you have to kind of talk about before we get into specific themes, what's the central idea of your book?
I think the central idea of my book is to show you that basically our world has ended up with, and particularly in the United States, we have ended up with a healthcare system and a healthcare infrastructure that doesn't service our needs on the healthcare side. And it also doesn't service our needs from a research point of view, that we have a gap that we created with the infrastructure that we built and that we continue to support between basically clinical care and clinical research. And more importantly, the second thing to really mention is the fact that of that infrastructure, be one thing, it was just simply a gap. But the problem that we also have is that our healthcare IT infrastructure on the care side, or the sort of provision of care side, is actually more billing oriented, and it is not at all clinical care or clinical truth oriented. And because it is billing oriented, it actually runs the biggest risk of being further exacerbating the issues that we have in our healthcare system with the advent of AI. So, in some sense, what's interesting is pre-AI, even though these were two very not necessarily well organized kind of ecosystems, we had ways to bridge. We had ways to bridge. Might have been expensive, but we could sort of figure out what was going on inside of clinical care, even with very bad billing data, to be able to sort of infer enough to help us support our research. The challenge now is that by adding AI into the mix and not knowing that, we have run the risk of basically accelerating this billing oriented infrastructure that will actually continue to further corrupt and degrade the data. And as it corrupts and degrades the data from being further and further away from clinical truth, because it will lack context, because it will not be properly curated, because the models will just basically up the potential of errors, that we are now going to actually directly affect our ability to do clinical research. So we're actually going to worsen our situation in the world in terms of our speed of finding new therapies and our speed of increasing our better health of our population. And it will all be because there might be a very blind application of AI that will actually feed right into a lot of the structural issues of healthcare that have been propped up by a health IT system that, for the most part, pre-AI, we were able to kind of work around. And I think that my perspective on writing this book was this urgency of saying, before we go too far, please stop, think a moment. Our health IT system wasn't built in a way to support our patients and our physicians. It was meant to support a billing apparatus. Oh, and by the way, we're dependent on that data to actually support clinical research. And if it goes down, clinical research goes down, and we will all be worse off for it. So in many respects, the book was written both as a call to action, a rapid sort of information of giving a lot of context and a lot of history and a lot of legacy of what our current system was, so that more people would be aware of the fact that we had a perennial gap that was about to get larger between clinical care and clinical research, where clinical care could not inform clinical research and vice versa. And at the same time, we also ran a huge risk of the fact that our the inequities and the hostility within the U.S. healthcare system was just going to get worse.
Okay, thank you. That's really powerful. And it's again a lesson in across other industries as well, that if you don't kind of address some of the systemic issues and are not intentional about how you adopt technology, you can make things worse. And here you make a big point about the disconnect between the care and the research side, and how, because of the transactional nature, uh, if we don't kind of address that, AI is going to worsen it. So, can you give an example of how, if actually the systems are connected and patients are better informed, what kind of a difference it can make? I read this, one of the examples in your book about this woman who has the stage 4 cancer, and then she gets access to certain clinical trials because she's better informed and her life gets saved. Could you just describe that, to kind of describe the potential of kind of bridging the systems, right?
So what's really interesting about that particular story was it was about a woman who had stage 4 and a very rare eye cancer, and there were no really good therapies available on the marketplace. But her father was a physician, and she was about to go through what was a course of chemotherapy that was sort of more generally prescribed, and it was being used in a way that they thought might be helpful for her eye cancer. Okay. And that was largely because there weren't a lot of things available at the time. And her father was the one who stopped her and said, no, 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 no. If you take that chemotherapy regimen, what will happen now is that you will become ineligible for some of the new experimental therapies that exist out there. So you will be ineligible to be included in that clinical trial. So do not start that. And so she doesn't start it. Her physician father helps her find other trials that she can be a part of. And she actually goes through 4 trials, 4 different therapeutics before she finds one that actually cures her of her cancer. Basically, now her prognosis is really quite good. But that would not have happened had it not been for the intervention of her father. But more importantly, this is less around could he find all the clinical trials that she could be involved in. It was the fact that he was aware enough to say, if you take this current prescribed chemotherapeutic regimen, you will actually put yourself in an ineligibility category, and that is not where you want to be. So this is actually one of those areas where you really could see that what a difference it would make if patients had a better understanding of basically what inclusion and exclusion criteria are in terms of what the different therapies are. If they had more access to actually what are the therapies that exist, if their physicians could help them, actually guide them through the possibility of being involved in a clinical trial and what that would mean. But that would actually involve so much different information available to multiple parties. Number one, that would involve that the inclusion and exclusion criteria are very clear and easily updated. That does not exist in clinicaltrials.gov today. Okay. It just is very difficult to be able to keep it up to date. It's because it's all voluntary. It's somewhat voluntary in terms of its timing of when information is available, even though it's mandatory that all clinical trials have to be listed there. The second part is that most physicians don't have access to necessarily what is the most cutting edge or the newest therapeutics unless they are in an academic center, which is problematic since most patients aren't seen in academic centers. You know, maybe in an urban area they might be, but not really, because for the most part, most people go and visit private doctors and also community hospitals and different areas there, and a lot of that information is not available. Third of all, it's one thing to know the information; it's another thing to actually know how to get access to it. But the third is, what would you do differently, right? You would not take a prescribed course of therapy. What are your options? These are things that become much more difficult to kind of assess out on an individual basis. Part of it is information driven, but part of it is judgment driven, and part of it is also guidance driven. And if you think about it from that perspective, what does our current health IT system do for physicians and patients? On the one hand, information that exists in clinical trials exists outside of the electronic health record. It exists on websites. Okay, it exists in sort of, you have to go find your information elsewhere. Even if it is well managed, it doesn't matter. It's like you have to go find it elsewhere. Second of all, your physician doesn't even have access to all of the data in a very comprehensive way to be able to look at it across time, so that there's no ability to sort of understand progression of disease unless they're reading their past notes. And most of their past notes now exist in fields inside of an electronic record that is basically like assembled.
Sure.
Third of all, since most of the electronic record is sort of designed to be more billing oriented, then any piece of information that might be useful for a clinical trial is going to be a little bit buried. It's going to be buried in an unstructured node or just won't even be captured. So you are now missing a little bit of information. And fourth of all, because of the way the pressures of the health system work, the likelihood of a physician sitting down and talking to you about clinical trials, even if they had access to all of the information about it, is probably pretty low. So, we can also sort of say that our system makes it so that it's impossible unless you yourself are strong enough as an advocate or you have an advocate with you to actually go and find the types of treatments that might be available to you. And that's a really situation of where we have forgotten about learning. We have forgotten about the need to have information to help us guide our ability to make maybe uncertain types of decisions. And instead, we have treated data much more as definitive way to ensure transactions get fulfilled.
Sure. And going to that, could you describe how that has happened? Because when the electronic records first came, uh, presumably it was to actually get better information about patients. And how did it get to such a transactional system? And especially, could you talk about the role of, I think you talk about the high-tech policy in the book, right? That actually was a big game changer in a sort of in a negative way, I think, from your book, right? So could you just talk about that briefly? Yeah.
So the earliest electronic medical records, and I will emphasize the word medical, not health. Okay, medical records were actually built by physicians and programmers in the 60s and in the 70s, and they were trying to use it to assemble the data around a patient to support clinical reasoning. Okay. And then the challenge is that over time, that changed and they morphed into what we would call electronic health records, and that's today's term, because it was started to become optimized for billing and compliance and revenue cycle management. And so once you started to repurpose the documentation that was inside the electronic record to serve more payment workflows, the physicians started writing more for the billing system rather than for one another. What ended up occurring was a series of policies that basically locked in that direction. So for the early days, the electronic medical record was very expensive. Technology was very expensive, and people were not accustomed to entering forms online. So you have to remember at that point in time, these were often closed systems. And then but the closed systems were expensive to manage, right? As the computing age starts to grow and more terminals are more available and more technology has made it a little bit easier to enter information from multiple places. But the challenge was you had lots of vendors out there putting out their own electronic medical records, oftentimes more regionally focused because the technology, remember, we didn't have cloud tech then. Back then, it was hard. You had to keep things localized. So we had basically closed systems that wouldn't talk to one another. And the government said, oh, this is a disaster. We can't do that. We're going to try and push forward the concepts of interoperability. What happens is that the adoption rate amongst the physicians was still really low. It's like never really broke 20%. The challenge that existed was that nobody wanted to buy it. They were saying, this is way too expensive. I'm not going to buy it. And plus, meanwhile, we've also created our own homegrown systems. So in 2008, we have obviously a global economic meltdown, spurred on by the housing crisis. And in 2009, in the United States, we have a series of recovery bills that are passed literally to try and stimulate the economy. One of those recovery bills, the ARRA, included a particular act called the High Tech Act. And the HITECH Act was based on a concept and the assumption that we needed electronic medical records everywhere. We could make this make the whole system run that much smoother, and we could manage the system better. We could manage costs better. So in high tech comes this combination of an incentive and a penalty. So the incentive was, okay, hospitals, okay, physicians, we will pay for your installation costs, but in order to ensure that you are going to spend that money in the right way, we are going to put a panel. We're going to say that you have to buy a certified electronic health record certified by the US government, which means that these vendors now all have to meet these certification requirements. Then the third part of this is if you don't do it, if you don't spend the money and you don't actually install something into your system, into your practice, we will penalize you. We will penalize you 1% of your Medicare, Medicaid dollars every single year for the next 5 years, up to 5% until you basically do it, because you are going to lose revenue in that respect. So now you're kind of really caught. Because if you're a physician or a hospital, you are number one, you now have to do it. You can't complain you don't have the money for it because arguably the government has now said, I'm subsidizing it for you. Two, if you don't do it, you're about to lose a lot of money. So, okay, you have to do it. But the third, and perhaps the worst thing of all, is you now have to use one that is certified by the US government, which means that if you were one of the earlier doctors who had built out a system or had been using a system, you had to get rid of it unless that system was somehow met the requirements of the government. And this traps everybody into the worst situation because now you do something, you create a market distortion. And the market distortion basically separates the users from the buyers. What happens in the marketplace is the vendors start shifting in a direction where they want to first meet the government certification requirements. And in many respects, only the largest were able to do that. Second of all, decimates the small vendor market because either they get gobbled up or they basically go out of business. And then third of all, now you have put all the market power on the vendors. And the vendors are now in a situation where they don't really care about your physician workflow. They don't really care about, whether your patients are happy or not. They care about meeting the certification requirements of the US government. But the worst part of it is that it disenfranchises the physicians even further, right? So they didn't have a voice in policy. Now they don't even have a voice in their operating system, and their needs don't really matter.
So this is, again, I mean, I think that's something I found quite interesting in this book, that if you don't think of, the second, third order effects of your kind of design choices, it's a really interesting story about how, when you adopt certain technologies or systems to adopt it, you may diminish the human being. That's described really well. And so one really interesting description I found is you describe the physician in their ideal role as the scientist and the detective who's really making sense and figuring out things. And from there, because of the system, gradually they're disempowered and they're almost like becoming data entry people trying to just comply with various requirements. Can you talk about that? First, the role of the physician as this detective or sense maker and the art and science of figuring out things, to kind of what happens to their lives with the system. Because I think that has a lot of applicability in other fields as well, where human expertise really matters, right?
So if you think about it, it really goes all the way back to medical training. The physicians are trained in medical school to try and figure out what's going on, right? This is the differential diagnosis. What is happening to this patient? They are observing a series of different activities. They're observing certain measurements. They're observing a lot of things, and they're documenting their observations, and they're taught how to actually put these observations together into what might be a set of possibilities, a set of scenarios. And they're at the same time trying to take into account maybe their personal circumstances, Maybe these lab values, doesn't this match something that I've seen before or that someone else has seen before? And there's a lot of this that goes on. So it is very detective work oriented in the way that people are trained to be physicians. The other thing they're sort of being trained about is also this, and even as medical education has evolved over time, the general concept of documenting observations, of thinking through what this possibly could mean, of actually sleuthing your way through it, hasn't changed. What also hasn't changed is this idea that we might have more information that we can gather from either the patient or gather from family members or even gather from lab tests that we can start to help us be a little more precise and maybe narrow down our scenarios around diagnosis. Once we get to a diagnosis, then a large part of it is about managing, right? And it's all about maintenance and management. And so we use lots of different measurements to help us understand what might be happening or not happening, right? Is something getting worse, something getting better, something kind of staying steady state. So if you think about the way physicians are trained, none of that is based on anything more than learning to build judgment. And it takes a long time, right? It's 10, 15 years of learning how to sleuth out what's going on, to do something over and over and over again, to see multiple different cases, to have the opportunity to discuss what something could be or not be, to do post-mortem evaluations, to think about what might have happened. A lot of this is discussion. A lot of this is thinking. A lot of this is basically a canon that gets built over and over again. And this is the behavior. So if you think about it, physicians are naturally scientists. They are measuring and they are constantly looking for patterns. Two, they are detectives because they're trying to figure out what's going on with someone. And three, they're also taking care of people because they're also thinking about how do I measure progress, but more importantly, how do I help you when there are no options? Or, it's like, how do I help you figure out what to do? They play many, many different roles, and that's what their training is. So can you imagine what happens when they're dropped into the hospital system once they graduate or once they go through and they start with residency training and now they're documenting. Now they are literally spending their time documenting in a way on an electronic system that may or may not capture a lot of their information. It's sort of funny because if you think about it, physicians scribble things down on paper still sometimes, and they still spend a lot of time talking, right? These are things that they don't necessarily use electronic means to do because a lot of this is the art of discussion, the art of like thinking through things, collective thinking, judgment, things like that are sort of being developed, mentorship that goes on. And the electronic system doesn't come close to matching any of that sort of like workflow or even of any of that thinking. So when they come into to practice, there's an inherent tension that begins because all of a sudden you are now documenting so that you can get paid, so that everybody can get paid, so that the things go through, so that the labs happen, that the tests happen, and that the patient makes it through their system. And all of a sudden, because you're documenting through checkboxes now, and you're documenting through drop-down menus, and you're documenting in sort of a very, very sort of like thought of as a easier, more efficient way to document, in essence, a lot of times you're sort of stuck. You're stuck sometimes with the situation where you might have four choices and there's no other, and you're thinking none of these four exist, and I now have to rationalize my judgment to you. So I'm going to pick the least worst one, or I'm going to pick the one that gets me the result that I need, And so all of a sudden you're asking these people to start to game a system or use a system to be able to solve what they know is the right thing to do. That kind of inherent tension actually is the root of where burnout occurs because it means you're sort of living between what your sort of ethical, moral, and training has set you to do, and at the same time fulfill the transactional needs. And that's because, again, your system was never designed to match your thinking, match what might help you with your thinking, match your cognitives and moral obligations, but rather more like your financial obligations, your transactional obligations. You need to document this. So we have, in essence, ended up creating the most expensively trained documenters of care, and you need their signature. Here's the other part. Because the physician has all of the capabilities and the training that they have, they are awarded a license, right? A medical license. It is under the practice of that medical license that all technology sort of surfs under, because they're sort of saying that when you sign off on this, this becomes record. So I need you to check all these boxes and sign off on it. Oh, and by the way, you're liable if there's something wrong. So talk about sort of this added sort of pressure.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I think you've also said that that physicians don't have the tools to analyze their own patients. Is that correct?
That is correct. If you look at the largest electronic medical records and you look at the way their systems are built in such a way that even if I wanted to look across all of my patients to try and see if there was a pattern or even a subset of my patients, I would have to go to an analyst or someone who's basically working for the vendor to go pull that data for me so that I can then look at it. Meanwhile, I've lost half the context. Meanwhile, I've waited whatever, 2 weeks, 2 months, or whatever for that data. And so I can't even do it on a rapid basis. The idea that in a software industry you would not build a dashboard for your users for their needs is sort of even sort of dumbfounding in some sense, right? Why would this be the one industry you can't do it in? It's why physicians quietly keep parallel records.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier is interoperability, and that's important. And in the book also, you talk about that while it's important, there hasn't been much success there. Could you talk about that? Why it's so important? What's been the barrier to success?
So interoperability is felled by what most things are felled by human beings, right? It involves cooperation. Interoperability, if you think about it at a top level, it just simply means you're creating the same standards or you're creating the same technical standards or the same codes so that basically data can port from one system to another so that there isn't something getting clogged up along the way. And that's sort of interoperability and at the sort of the base level. Here's the problem. You need everyone to cooperate. This has never been a mandatory thing. This is a voluntary thing. So on the one hand, allowing information, free flow of information oftentimes supports industries and supports companies. And so you gain from that. And if you gain from that, you'd be more than happy to be part of an interoperable system. But if you aren't going to gain from it, and we do know that some of our large players do not gain from sharing information, then you will find ways to get around interoperability. You will sort of find ways to say you're protecting the patient. So you will information block. And in fact, right now, we have a series of lawsuits going on in the United States, which is just all around information blocking. And the last 10 years of policy moves made by our Office of the National Coordinator of Health IT have literally been around trying to get around and detect information blocking. So if that says anything, it means that there is no incentive to necessarily, or should I say, there's no generalized incentive to cooperate. There is maybe specific incentives to cooperate. And so interoperability doesn't function very well because of the fact that there isn't a generalized incentive to work together. And so when you start to use penalties, well, everyone can find a way around a penalty, especially a big corporation. So in that respect, you are highly, highly, highly dependent on people's willingness to cooperate for something that has been billed as a technical layer.
Okay, thank you. So getting on to AI and generative AI, and what, according to you, are the kind of big opportunities, like what that would really kind of help the physicians and patients? And then after that, if you could talk about what are the big risks, that would be really helpful.
So if I want to think about AI in a very positive way, it is a big technological leap, which gives an opportunity to reshuffle the world order. It always is. Every time you have a leap like this, it reshuffles the players. So I hope, and that's truly my hope, is that we will be able to use AI in a way to actually re-empower, or should I say rebalance? It's not really re-empower, it's really rebalance the healthcare system to be more physician and patient centric and to be more research oriented instead of more billing oriented. That's kind of the direction I would like to use AI in. And we have ways to do that. If you think about it, we can provide tools for patients to start to pull their data together in one place. At the end of the day, the law actually favors, and in the United States under HIPAA, HIPAA, the data, a patient's data belongs to them. And because it belongs to them, they, in theory, have rights to it. In practicality, they do not have so much rights to it, or they don't have easy access to it. This is an area where we can begin to start to put pieces together. That's one aspect of it. The second part of it is that for physicians, they can start to code or start to demand a seat at the table, that the design of what they have been asking for all along isn't that hard to do, right? We can do this a lot better. Our ability to actually code is a lot faster than we had in the past. So capabilities like being able to look across your patients or being able to do this should be a possibility we could be able to do. The third thing that we could possibly begin to do is that we could take billing data and start to turn it into something, abstract it into more closer to clinical observation. It's not going to be a one-to-one because of the fact that it will have to be more question oriented. Like, can I set it up for the context of this question? Can I set it up? Can I curate it for this context of this question? Or can I abstract for that? But we can speed that part up because of the fact we can teach a series of terminology to an AI model that makes it possible for us to at least generally sort categorically. So that actually helps us in a lot of ways. These are some of the ways that we'd have to speed this up. The third thing is that if we can start to connect these pieces a little bit further and make it easier to collect information at an observation level, we will also improve the quality of the data for research purposes. Just like on the receiving end, we can also begin to start to think about how we categorize information. So there are a lot of data model things that we can begin to do with AI that are really quite exciting.
Yeah. So can I ask? So also, I think you talk about not using large LLMs, right? You're talking about using smaller models, small language models, and RAGs, right? And you feel those are going to be more context specific and better. Is that correct?
It is correct. So small language models is something I've been sort of on the soapbox for quite some time. We, this is healthcare. We have, it's idiosyncratic in the way we use language and the way we use syntax, the way we actually describe different things, right? Sometimes we will describe, two different physicians will describe things quite differently, even if they necessarily have the same vocabulary. And one of the challenges we have is that words in a medical context may mean something quite different in a larger context or in a different context. Because LLMs do not really take into account context, because it's just literally models that are driven off of large corpora of data, it has a higher likelihood of hallucinations and has a higher likelihood of getting it wrong. Simply shrinking it down, in some sense, allows us to do a few things. Number one, it decreases the number of errors and hallucination because you have decreased the universe under which it is learning it from. Second of all, it's a little closer to point of care. And because it's a little closer to point of care, you have the ability to realign when it makes mistakes. This is how your models get built out. Third of all, you have an ability to audit and trace a little faster. And the reason you do is because the N is lower, right? So it already makes it a little more manageable. You can put your arms around it. And I think more importantly, we kind of want that level of sort of auditability and tightness and the ability to understand what we're looking at and train something on the various different contexts that we use in a medical setting and not be brought in with sort of like slang or anything else that might come from a larger corpora. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is an energy reason. First of all, small language models don't require as much energy. They actually they can be run on edge servers, which is a huge deal, okay? Not because it's purely because of an energy environmental point of view. It's because then it becomes affordable. It becomes actually usable and affordable. One of the things right now that's happening is that we have these pilots going through all of these different large EHRs that are with the largest sort of AI developers. And right now, because they're pilots, that means the bill hasn't arrived yet. When the bill arrives, they're going to see how expensive compute power is, how the use of tokens are basically driving up. Most corporations are starting to see that. They're creating budgets and they're creating rationing around tokens. The healthcare system hasn't even begun to do that. And what will end up starting to happen is people will be like, I don't need this, I don't need this, I don't need this, I don't need this. And that's probably true. There was a more responsible way to come at this, which is to make something that you could control the experiment under, and that you could manage the increase the quality of the input and output, and at the same time do it in a very responsible and cost-effective way. And that's why I'm a bigger fan of small language model. That is an example of thinking thoughtfully about responsible use.
And implicit in this, in your entire conversation, and I think you talk about it in the book, is also the value of unstructured data, observations, scribbled notes, and things like that. And I'm assuming in this dimension, generative AI, especially with the small language models, would probably be good at helping us. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Because if you train it on notes are just like narratives. That's all they are, right? And people write in lots of different ways. If you can start to train on a smaller corpora of notes, you can start to and provide the kind of context and commonly used ways of describing things together, you may build a much more precise model that will actually support the structuring of unstructured data, which is the data that, to be honest, everyone has not bothered touching all these years because that wasn't the information that was needed to basically push a bill through. All you needed was diagnosis, treatment, how often, what resources did you consume, things like that, that mattered more for being able to generate a bill. You did not need any of the thinking of the observations that might have been captured in an unstructured note, which is literally a narrative.
What about the biggest risks? What would you be really concerned about? What are your worries?
So the worries I have still comes down to the structural problems of our healthcare system. We still have these large incumbents in the healthcare system, which means they're the ones who are currently experimenting with LLMs, actually, I would say, not SLMs, right? And they are the ones who are pushing the pilots onto the physician population and onto the sort of healthcare system. And as they push these pilots through, right, thinking that they are solving administrative burdens for physicians, which sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, what they're really doing is trying to increase the efficiencies of their billing system, right? Let's try and decrease the number of denials we have. Let's increase the throughput of basically skipping a few steps and being able to get like something written correctly the first time and to get a bill in so it doesn't get rejected. Let's ensure that the revenue cycle management is easier to understand, easier to capture, easier to change out if there's a problem. Because those are the priorities of the large incumbent systems, most AI methods will be used to support that. And if it has effects on the physician population, it won't be because it's going to help the physician. Maybe incidentally it might, but for the most part, it's really still designed for this efficiency. And my worry is that that's just going to exacerbate the inequities of the way our care works. But more importantly, it will also actually do the opposite of structuring data for learning purposes. It'll actually make it easier for data to be categorized in a way so that it will support the billing infrastructure. So you're actually going to end up with here's your unintended consequence. The unintended consequences of shifting in that direction is the fact that you will degrade the quality of the data even further. So now you're going to force a really interesting situation. You're going to like drive it in this direction. You're going to be that much more efficient, but the quality of your unstructured notes are going to get worse. The quality of the notes in general are going to get worse, making it harder for research, making it harder for care, but you aren't going to pay any attention because this has become more efficient. So I do think that this is the part that I worry about. I think the most irresponsible use of AI is to reinforce the same billing driven, compliance driven dynamics that already distort care today, only you're doing it faster and at a larger scale. And then you may end up creating some unintended consequences that are going to further alienate your physician, patients, and your researchers. You're going to affect the quality of even the data that they get to use. I think this is actually the most irresponsible way to apply it. And unfortunately, that is the way that things are going because that is the easiest application of AI.
Okay, so yeah, that's worrying. And given that this is not a book about shortcuts. I mean, one of the things I really like about your book is your tackling very kind of intractable issues. There's this book by Daniel Resner called The Ideas Industry, where he talks about that a lot of thought leaders take some kind of narrow idea and they push it and commercialize it. They're not speaking truths to power. And This book is not like that. It's really talking about some hard problems. And so my kind of question is, how are you going about uh, trying to kind of influence the system, given that the task is so huge?
And part of it is also just driving awareness. That's the start point. For a lot of people, this book was very surprising to them. For anybody who was in health IT, I watched a lot of really interesting reactions. I watched the reaction that most people are like, oh my gosh, I have heartburn again. I remember this. I remember this. I remember this, right? They started feeling really actually ill reading it because I think they recognized a lot of it and they remember that feeling of helplessness because there were quite a number of people who tried very hard along the way to give warnings as health IT was sort of building out. And a lot of these folks, when they read the book, they just like it brought them back to a point in time when they felt like they didn't have a say in the way things played out. And it's kind of like where you already know the ending, you already know the train crashes. And so reliving it is not always a great feeling. But on the other hand, what it also did was it also helped a number of people think about things very differently. For physicians, whenever I was speaking in physician audiences, most of them were like, oh, wow, you have finally put words to something that we have never been able to explain what happened to us. And so now my hope is that they will be a little bit more empowered to speak up. And if nothing else, minimally asked to be at the design table since they were outside of the design table from the beginning. I think that's one part of it. And then for patients, a lot of them are like, oh my goodness, how is it that my data isn't in one place? How is it that this has happened? How is this? And I think what happens is with a greater general awareness, there's at least the willingness to ask questions. There's at least the willingness to challenge. That is what I'm really hoping will start to drive. And it's one of the reasons why I've been speaking to many different types of audiences. I've used the book as a way to give tours and events to talk about it with different groups, sometimes physician groups, sometimes patient groups, most recently actually with design groups. That's been one of the most exciting is to talk to I gave a talk at Pratt, which is a design institute in New York recently, and largely what fascinated everyone was this idea that something could have been designed this way or that there was a lack of design and that this was an opportunity to start thinking about how do you design for the future, like where has the absence of design actually hurt us, or should I say the unimpeded design of something that might have been based off of a series of misguided assumptions have led us to. And I think, if nothing else, that sort of conversation at this moment in time, when people are starting to ask the questions about the rapid speed of AI and what we're giving up along the way, I think that this might be a beginning of how you get people thinking about building the right solutions, or at least putting pressure on the incumbents to change things. And I suppose one of the other things to do is to start to think about creating the disruptors around in the larger marketplace, because we can't keep going on. This is actually an unsustainable situation. Strangely enough, AI has made the status quo unsustainable. There's going to be a break point, and the break point, you're already seeing it in small ways. I've met along the way also concierge physicians who have gone back to paper. They are no longer taking their records on electronic. They are doing it on paper. And they can cite you a million reasons for why paper is better. What's interesting about the reasons that they cite is that so many of those reasons were the same arguments that were used, 20 years ago in the argument for why you should use electronic, which is really fascinating. They mention things like security. They mention things like being able for patient safety. They're talking about it from the fact of being able to capture their thinking so that when they go back to a manila folder and open it up and read their note, it's exactly the same as where they left it last time, right? It hasn't changed. They have the ability to think about things. They can provide better care. I'm thinking about how all of those platitudes were used, 20 plus years ago, talking about what health IT was going to do for you, what electronic health records were going to do for you. When it's amazing that we've kind of gone in this other direction. And again, like I said, they're a small outlier in some respect, but I don't think they're as big of an outlier as people realize,
But
because every off use, yeah.
it does highlight, the problem very well, even if it's not a big group. So my last question is, this is really focused on the US. What are some lessons that if you're outside the US that you can take? For instance, I live in the UK, but what can other countries learn from your book?
Well, first of all, don't let an American EHR come into your country. Okay, that's the first thing I would mention. And I realize that genie might be already out of the bottle already, but I would say because they're going to bring to you a design that you did not ask for. Okay, and that does not match actually your the priorities and the way resources are allocated in your various countries. I think that's an important thing to mention. I think the other thing to mention is ask the question around, how do new systems, when they are developed, especially if they're using AI, do they begin with some humility around the data and around clear boundaries around where AI should or should not be used? Is it being used in a way where, you're augmenting and supporting the people who are using the system, and that things are explainable or they're editable? And does it reorient the design control? I think these are things that to think about, like sort of learn a little bit from the fact that in the US, we have set up ourselves in a situation where decision support and decision control sometimes are the same thing because things quietly surface their way down that direction. We have automation complacency. Hey, you know what? It takes me 5 extra minutes to go around a system, so I might as well just go through it and just pick the least worst point. I think these are moments in time to actually say, no, we don't want a system like that. We want a system that reflects our priorities. We want an IT system that supports our priorities. It gives us maybe more transparency around our subpopulations, gives us more understanding around how we think about disease in our country, how we think about, sort of the distribution of both resources and around disease and conditions around it. Like there's so many interesting things we could be learning. But if you are going to buy a system, I suggest you not buy an American system because these EHR systems will not be designed for the purposes of what you want, and you will find yourself in a different transactional loop, and that's not a great loop. The other thing to sort of mention is that in the US, we have an unusual situation. I'm not sure we're the only ones, but our laws make it so that the patient data belongs to the patient. So we are the owners of our own data. That doesn't necessarily exist in every country. I think that's important because from the perspective, from our point of view, our goal is try and gain access to it, trying to put it together, trying to give it some context, some meaning, and some understanding so that we can be empowered enough to make our own decisions because it's a very individualistic kind of society. So we have to move in that direction of sort of at least be empowered enough with information to be able to seek out care. That is not necessarily the case in every other country, but just because that isn't necessarily the case doesn't mean that the data doesn't carry a lot of weight and that there isn't an ability to think about how can I see my data? How can I have access to it? How can I be a participant in this, even if we have a government that maybe uses data properly? It doesn't matter. There might be a learning in there around how many other voices do you want in the mix, particularly the people of which the data is about.
Great, great. Thank you. This was a fantastic conversation, and I want to congratulate you on writing this book. And for the viewers, obviously, if you're interested in healthcare, it's a fantastic book. But I actually think one learns a lot through analogies. So even if you're outside healthcare, there are many themes which might have struck you as quite relevant. At the highest level, taking a systems view and thinking of structural issues before adopting technologies, thinking of second and third order effects, realizing that to adopt technology, sometimes you will diminish your human experience and it might lead to your own kind of disempowerment. So this whole idea of being very intentional about the way you design things, the importance of context, the importance of curation. These are all, and even tactical things like using small language models, both from an energy perspective and even more control. One of the things I found very fascinating about Ying is that she understands data and technology really well and feels accountable. And I think that's very important if we want to create responsible AI in any industry. So you have to kind of get into the nitty-gritties of data and understand how messy it is. At the same time, really care about outcomes. So I'll stop here. Thanks a lot, Ying. It's been wonderful to have you on this podcast. And viewers, if you like this, subscribe to the podcast and share it. And until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.